Cool. Okay, thanks everyone for coming to my second talk of the weekend. Yes, I was speaking about automated testing. Today I'm talking about Tailwind CSS, just making sure I was showing the right slides. So yeah, definitely a full stack speaker this weekend. Fun and today back at yesterday. If you want to see these slides later on, they're on that link at the bottom of the page. Both presentations. These are probably two of my favorite subjects about testing and Tailwind. I've been using Tailwind for a long time and using it in Drupal and other things like Symfony and Vue.js and various other things as well, which is something I like. I like tools I can use across multiple different projects and CMSs and frameworks rather than something that only works in one. So first of all, we're going to talk a little about utility-first CSS as a concept before we start talking about Tailwind as a framework. So utility-first CSS is a different way to write CSS than the way that we're probably all taught or learned online. In fact, it's probably the opposite way. We're usually told to write CSS in CSS files. You keep your HTML in your HTML files, or for us, doing Twig, or if you're doing React, you're using JSX or Vue files. The two are very separate and don't speak to each other. Very often, you're always doing this constant switching between HTML file to CSS file, and people are quite opinionated about what things should be called and what things do. Utility-first CSS spins that on its head. So instead of writing it in separate files, we're working primarily in our HTML and in our templates, so in our Twig or our JSX or our Vue files. Instead of writing CSS with rules with lots of rules in them, we use CSS with lots of smaller CSS rules with very small things in them, usually one thing, single responsibility principle applied to CSS. So we'll see examples in a minute. Tailwind sometimes has some with multiple, but most of the time they just do one thing and do one thing well, and they usually correlate to the actual CSS thing that you're trying to implement. And the classes are named based on what they do, not where they're used, which is usually a big no-no. We're told that CSS classes shouldn't, or HTML classes shouldn't not be related to how the things look. They're to do with where they're placed on a page. For example, like it's an events page or an events page card or something, not that it's bold or text green or whatever. So very much the opposite way around. So the traditional approach, we write something like this. So in the CSS file, we've got H1. We're going to set a font size, a weight, a color, and some padding, and we'll set the values there. I assume most of us have written CSS like this before, similar to this. And of course, we expand this and we add more things. We've still got a H1. We've also got a card component now with some padding, and then we've got a card styling the paragraph within the card. We're already starting to see duplication here. So we've got the same font size repeated in both places on our H1 and on our card paragraph. It's a very, very arbitrary example. We're going to set the font weight on both places. So we're saying that both these things are going to be bold, and both these things are going to have the same color. And also, the card has a 2rem padding, and H1 also has a 2rem padding. So we're already seeing this duplication, and because this is just a very small example with a few CSS rules in it, imagine this multiplied by X number of things. So you can see how the CSS grows a lot over time. And when you add a new component, the CSS keeps growing and growing and growing because we're repeating the same things over and over again. The utility first approach is said the other way around. So we'll write classes, or we'll have classes like this. So a lot of people have this sort of face when they see this for the first time. This is bad. It does take some getting used to. It's not, you have to try it and get used to it. So like I said, most of these things just have one thing in them. So font weight is, or font bold is font weight bold. We've got a text slate 900 that sets it to that color that we saw earlier on, the hex code for the dark gray color. Text 5XL is a text size of 3rem, and we've got a flex for display flex. So very different to what we're used to seeing. But what we don't have now is that repetition anymore. So bold, something like that. So it solves a few different problems for us. We don't waste time and energy inventing class names. So we don't need to think what something needs to be called in order to style it, which for me is a big advantage. I don't have to think whether it's an event card or a sidebar left or sidebar right or something. I also need to make up silly names. I've written classes like sidebar left top inner wrapper before to try and target something specific, because that's what I'm told to do. But usually it's just a flex container. So I'd rather just put flex class on it. That's all it needs to do, really. Because I'm working primarily in HTML files or Vue or JSX or whatever, I'm not switching between HTML and CSS all the time. So I'm a lot more productive because I'm only really working in the one file. There is a style sheet, but you very rarely ever need to go to it and change anything in it. From a Tailwind perspective, it gets generated for you automatically. But once it's there, you don't need to look at it again. And you know what these classes do, and you don't need to keep going back and adding to it or editing it. The CSS stops growing because we're not adding new CSS or writing new CSS every time we need to add a new component. We've already got a class of flex. We will reuse it. We don't need to make a new class and say that also is flex, and that is flex, and that is flex. We could just reuse the same components over and over again. And making changes is simpler. So I don't know about everybody else, but when I've worked with a normal CSS approach, I'm scared to change things because I don't know if I change this one thing here, what else is going to change everywhere else in my website or my application. Because CSS is usually global scope. This changes it to be the other way. This makes it a local scope. So I can read it and I can see what it does and see what it looks like just by reading it. And admittedly, there might be quite a few classes on it, but I can tell that it is a text red and font XL and font bold and underlined, etc., etc. I can know that by reading it. I don't need to go to a different file to find that out. But if I want to make this a different size or a different color, I can change it by changing the class on that element and not have to worry about breaking something somewhere else. So let's see some examples. I've been giving this talk a few times. These examples are a little bit old, but still relevant. This is the Laravel Nova website. This is the Firefox Send website. And we're at a Drupal camp, so hopefully some people recognize the Bartik site. Although it's not the Bartik website, this is a version of the Bartik website that I built with Tailwind CSS. So it's a static HTML page built, and this is built with Tailwind CSS classes. One of the other things I quite like about this approach is that these don't look the same. There's a common thing with using other CSS frameworks. They all look very similar because they're all based on the same style sheets, essentially. You've got the components and the CSS is written at a much higher level. So you've got a card or a header or a banner component, which is very opinionated and has styles built into it. The classes that we were seeing earlier on are a lot lower level and they're a lot more reusable. I can reuse a PX5 class on that project, and that project, and that project. It does the same thing, but the outputs are very different. These sites are all built using the same framework, but look nothing alike. So Tailwind CSS is a highly customizable, low-level CSS framework. It's a framework that is built on this utility-first class approach. And I keep saying that utility first because you can write CSS if you need to, sometimes you need to, but it's about using these utility classes in the first instance. I tend to think of it as a CSS utility class generator. It's a framework that builds my framework for me. So it generates the classes that I need to use in my project, which is also great because I'm not linked to, I'm not dependent on using some other framework and having it tell me what my classes need to be named or what my colors need to be. I can customize this myself, which we'll see later on. So we saw an example of some of the sorts of things that we could do utility classes for. These are some of the original ones that Tailwind shipped with, I think about 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe it's been a little while. So we've got colors, so text and border and background, font weights, font families, font sizes, alignment, so whether we want to align things to the left or to the right or to the center, whether we want to set different paddings or margins or negative margins. We can add flexbox, we can say flex or flex grid or flex col. Positioning, we can set whether something is relative or absolute, sticky. List styling, z-index, whether things are opaque or have some sort of opacity value. And then we've had some of these other things added in the more recent versions. These are slightly older versions now. There's been new things. Things like screen reader visibility. So we can say SR only to make things only accessible or only visible to screen readers. We could change the color of the placeholder. We can set the first child or the last child or the nth child even. We can use CSS grid now. It's like now, again, this was a little while ago, but everybody wanted CSS grid. And initially we were like, how, well, was it we, Adam, the Tailwind team, how do we implement CSS grid using this approach? But they figured it out and now it's there. We can use transitions and transforms, and spacing and divide are two of my favorites. So instead of setting a top margin, for example, in every box, you can set it on the parent and say that these things should have so much spacing between them, and it will add them for you to each child element or each direct child element, except for the first one. Before you had to have had add MT or MT4 on each one, and then have to either not add it to the first one somehow, or you would reset it yourself or do some sort of negative margin trick. Likewise, if you want to put borders between each thing, you can use divide, just adds borders between each thing. Focus rings, text clamping. So there's a lot in there, and there's a lot more than that, especially since I've did these slides last. But seem to be adding new things every time, all the time. So some examples. These are the display classes. So we can say display block or inline or flex or grid. We can set font sizes. So in this case, it's using a t-shirt size approach. So we've got small, base, large, extra large, 2 extra large, up to I think 7 or 8 XL. And I quite like these as class names. And Tailwind isn't the only utility class framework out there. There are others from before. I used one called Tachyons before, which did something very similar. Tachyons was mostly based on how can I make something as performant as possible. When Adam wrote Tailwind, his idea was to make things as reusable as possible. I'm always copying these 100 classes, also however many classes it was between projects. I'll make it into a framework, sort of. The Tachyons one uses classes like DB for display block and DI for display inline. The Tailwind ones are a bit more verbose. Admittedly, they're a bit longer to type, but they're a lot more readable. I think I can read that and know what they are. I forget what all the Tachyon ones are, but there we are. So, yep, these are the font sizes using t-shirt approach. Tailwind also uses the numeric scale in places. So, written some early versions, we had multiple blues, for example, apps, I guess, because we're at a Drupal conference. But they were all called light or lighter or dark or darker. That became a bit difficult to scale, because if you're wanting to add a custom color into your project, you then start making up new words like darkesterer, which isn't a thing, right? So after a while, they moved to using this numeric-based approach, and it's much easier for you to put a text blue 250 in there if it's fitted into your into the scale. So now we've got an idea about what it is and how to use it. Like, how do we actually install it? So there is a CDN version available. So you can just add the CDN onto your project and it will work, but you will get all the things when you install it. There's a lot of CSS and a lot of classes. A lot of them you're not going to use. It was a few megabytes last time I looked at it. It's probably grown quite a lot now that a lot of the newer things have gone in again. New things have been added. There is a play.tailwindcss.com website as well. You can go on and just try things and see how they work for you. But in your project, you're probably going to do this and add it as a dependency. So it's a node package. So you're going to run npm install Tailwind CSS, and it will add it as a dependency to your package JSON file. And then you can run it. So you can just make npx Tailwind or yarn Tailwind. Then specify the content, so we just tell it where our files are. Talk about that in a minute. And then when to output, and it will generate the files, the generated files for you. There's a configuration file we can use. It's optional. Talk again about that in a minute as well. And the newer versions of Tailwind they're working on, you don't need to specify the content either. It sort of scans your project for you and figures out where the files are, which is really cool. So interaction states, we also come with all these different states we could use. So everything we've already seen in terms of things like font weight and text sizes can all be prefixed with one of these. And this is where we start getting away from inline styles, because that's when people see things like font weight 500 or text green, people go, well, this is the same as I could do that with an inline style. Why would I use this? This is where we start to move away from that, because we can't do things like hover states and focus states based on with inline styles. So how does this work? We have a state, like we've just seen. So hover is usually the one I'll talk about. Then there's a separator. So usually it's a colon, the 2 dots. You can change it if it doesn't work for you. There are situations I've seen where that can't be used for some reason, so people have changed it. And then we put the class name at the end. So it's the same class name we would use before, just added a prefix with something else. So for example, hover, colon, textred 500. Make this thing textred 500 when we hover over it, or when we focus on it. We can use a focus prefix as well. This is the CSS that it generates to do this. So we've got our usual textred 500 with the color that says what it is. We've also then got the hover state. So there's the dot hover, then we're escaping the colon, which I didn't realize we could do until I started looking at this, but I thought was really cool. And then we use the normal pseudo selector at the end, colon hover. So it's a hover at the front and hover at the back. And then likewise a focus. So that's how that works. And then to use it, we just add them onto the class that we want to affect. So this one is textred 500, but then hover, we want to make it 800. So we want to change the color when we hover over it. So responsive, Tailwind is responsive. It does mobile first by default. And very similar to interaction states that we saw, we can also prefix things with screen names. So we think back to the text sizes, we use that t-shirt size scale, small, medium, large. We've also got a series of breakpoints that we can use that are also called small, medium, large, or extra large. Same as interaction states. We can put the name of a screen, use the separator key, then put the utility class name at the end. So if you want to say this thing should flex, we want to set display flex at the medium screen size, we do MD colon flex. And we can stack them. So we could say only when we hover over it, we want to make it BG red 500, but only do that at the medium screen size. So we can start chaining these states together, which becomes really interesting. I like this approach. I like the fact we can just prefix the usual class name with the thing. In Bootstrap, for example, you can do sort of col MD6 or something. So the actual class name is changing based on the screen size that you're trying to target, which, you know, it works, but I like the fact that the name doesn't change at all. Just makes it easier to see, in my opinion. So how does this work? We've got the usual block is display block, which I think is I just love the simplicity of that. For some reason, block is just display block. And then we've got our media query that says at the minimum width of 640 pixels, we do SM, again, we'll escape that colon, and then say display block. And as I said, min width by default, you can set maximum width breakpoints if you want to, or if you said, I want to do between two things, you could do that as well. Completely customizable. So how do we use it? If we've got some divs, we've got a wrapper, and then we've got 2 boxes inside the wrapper, or 2 columns inside the wrapper. We can say that it's supposed to be a display block by default. So we put them on top of each other, which is the default anyway. but the medium size, we want to put them side by side. So we're going to move from here to here. So we'll do that on our wrapper. And then on each column or each box inside, previously they are width full, so they are width 100%, and we'll shrink them down to be width 1/2 when we hit to a medium screen. And again, I just like the fact that it says 1/2. It's just little things like that to me. It's just I quite like it. Don't know why. Arbitrary values, I'm still on the fence a little bit about. One reason I like this approach is that you've got a set of predefined classes that you can use in your projects that have been agreed ahead of time. These are the colors that we use on this project. These are the text sizes that we use on this project. And then those are the ones that you need to pick from. You don't have a 16 pixel font here and a 17 there and a 12 there and a 10 there and all these different colors that are very slightly hex code different that look exactly the same to everybody. Things look more consistent and your CSS is smaller because you're using less classes and therefore your site is more performant. Arbitrary values were added into Tailwind more recently, and you use the square bracket, and then anything inside the square bracket becomes a class. So if I don't have a width of 23 pixels, but it will make one called width 23 pixels because I've put it inside that square bracket. And it works responsively, and it can work it with colors and everything as well. There are some situations where I've used it, and it does get me out of a hole and solves a problem. It's something that should be used sparingly. Apologize for the wrapping. But we can also use the theme function that Tailwind gives us, and we can get values out of its configuration as well. So there's a configuration value for spacing 32, which equates to 1000 rem. I don't know what it is, but we'll use that in that place. But we can also use arbitrary selectors as well. I have used these ones. So again, I can say I can make something, let's do this backwards, underline on hover if it's the third child in the list, presumably, or the grid, only at the large screen size. So you can get quite specific. Again, I tend not to use it unless I need to, but there we are, it is there. Also, I've not looked at this slide for a while, and I can still read it and understand what it does and what it looks like, which is great. How do I deal with repetition? I was going to put that slide in twice, but I was going to. One of the common problems you see people look at with Tailwind-based sites is they will right-click on it and say View Source, and they see all these duplicated class names everywhere. And if you've got a list of cards or a list of whatever, or a section of cards, each card has 10 classes or 20 classes on it, and they just see those repeated multiple times. And they assume that this is difficult to maintain because there's all these classes duplicated everywhere. But we have a thing to solve that. We have templates, templating languages, and all the languages have them. So this is a twig example that we can use a loop for. So if you've got a list of cards or a list of nav items, for example, so in my menu at the top of my page, I don't need to write every item in my nav item. I can use a loop for that. So I've only got one set of classes. So we can use the for, say every item. This is a Sculpin example. So it's a static site generator uses twig. So it's twig, but you can do the same in Drupal as well. So for every item in my list of nav items, we're going to output this block of HTML with this list of classes in it. So we've only actually got this list of classes once. It might be output 10 times if you look at the HTML, or you right click and you do view source. But if I want to change this and change it from text small to text large, for example, or something, I only need to do it in one place because it's looping over them. I don't have to change it 10 times, I only have to change it once. You can do the same things in React or JavaScript or whatever you've done. I've done it in WordPress with template parts. This is using JSX, I think, example. So we can, same thing, we've got a list of nav items, we can map over them, so we'll loop over them. We can get each nav item and we can output it. So we input our there we go, sorry. Each map item, and then, yeah, we put the same markup essentially in it. We've still got a link in there. The href is different because this is JSX, but the same idea. And the title is different. But again, the same principle applies. We've only got one link. We're just looping over it multiple times and putting the variable bits here and here. The classes stay the same. So if I wanted to change it again, I can change it in one place. This is something I was doing for one of my projects. This is building a Taekwondo club website, or maybe it's the Jiu-Jitsu club website, it doesn't matter. We wanted to put a list of classes. So as in a list of classes people could go to do the thing. So they wanted adult classes and then children classes at the top with a list in between. So I was able to extract that out to an include or a partial that had all the classes in it that were the same. And I was able to pass in the data, which was dynamic to the class times. I could pass those in dynamically as variables or as essentially as props for JavaScript. And then inside the include, that does the looping or everything inside it and filters things out. Again, if you're doing JSX or something, same sort of idea, you've got a subcomponent called class list, and we put the classes in literally as props in this case. It's been a while since I did JSX. I think this is from an Astro project I was doing. There we go. As I said, things can get big if you use like the CDN version with all the classes in it. But Tailwind's got this idea figured out, and it does certain things to keep the file size small. What it used to do at the beginning was in dev mode, it built everything. So you got all the classes. It was about 3 megabytes of class names at the time. It's probably more like 10 now at least, I would assume. So they were all there for you locally. So they showed up in your dev tools and everything, but it then slowed down your dev tools because they were massive. And then you would then purge them. So we'd use a tool called purge CSS to then say, scan my files. I don't use text red 300 in my project, remove it. But then what they did is implemented this just-in-time mode. So remember at the beginning I was talking about that content array. In the Tailwind configuration file, you tell it where your files are. It will scan them for you, look at the classes you have used, and only generate the classes if you use them, which is great. So I only get the classes I actually use in my project. I don't have to deploy the whole 10 megabytes of CSS or whatever it is. I've seen it done. I've looked at projects that have done it, and realistically, it's probably a few kilobytes of actual files that you've used, especially by the time you've compressed them down and cached them, which is great because the classes don't change very often, so you can cache them for as long as you want. So this is a Drupal example. So we're just going to say in a theme, we're just going to look at twig files inside the templates directory. But this could be, you can also do curly brackets in here as well and say, I want to look for JSX, TSX, .astro, .twig, .something. Like you can have a whole list of them and say, look for all these types of files that we've got. This is the same as that dash content if you're using the CLI tool from the beginning. But in the new version of Tailwind, they've sort of figured this out, so how to do it automatically, which is really quite cool. I think you can still override it if you want to. So customizing, we can run npx tailwind init, which will initialize a new configuration file. And this is what that looks like. Again, in the new version of Tailwind, which I think is Tailwind 4, this is currently not a thing. This is gone, and they're customizing it with actual CSS variables instead. So you dash color red 500, which I think is pretty cool. But I'm hoping they put some sort of backwards compatibility layer in that it still works with this. And in the original version, you'd get the whole file. So you've got all the defaults, so all the default colors, all the default font sizes, everything in this file, and it was up to you to maintain it. And then you would add your extra things in. Now this is just your file. So there is a default file, there's then your file that gets merged into it, and then it becomes the whole file together. So we've already seen the content part, so we've already seen what that does. We've now got this theme section. This is where we customize it based on our project, essentially. So if, for example, we want to set the colors we've got, so Tailwind comes with a lot of colors out of the box, all the different reds and greens and blues, etc., that it comes with, but we might not want all of those. So on the project, we might have 5 colors that we want to use. We've got a primary and a secondary and a tertiary and a background and something. So if we want to just say, don't use the normal Tailwind colors and don't generate text red 400 and all those, just generate text primary or text inherit in this case, actually. So inside the colors object, we can define whatever we want for our project, and it will only generate those classes. Remember I said it's the class generator. It will generate the classes I need for my framework, essentially, for my project. If I didn't want to override all the colors, I wanted to extend the color palette or anything else, instead of putting it in theme, I'll put it inside extend. And it will extend and add it on to rather than replace. If you did want to see all the options, you can do init -- full. It will generate the whole file for you. It'd be interesting. So how do we add it to our CSS? This step is optional now. But if you've got this, then you don't need this file actually. But if you did want to add more stuff into it, then you can still add it. And Tailwind CSS is a post CSS plugin. So if anybody's ever used Auto Prefixer, it's probably the nearest thing I can sort of compare it to. It will look for these placeholders in your file and then go, this is where the base styles go. I will replace this placeholder with the base styles. I will replace this with the Tailwind components, and then utilities, which are text red, font bold, etc. And this is where the ordering becomes quite important if you're going to do that, if you're going to add new things. So we want our custom utilities to override Tailwind's utilities, and we want those to override the custom components. We want our custom components to override the Tailwind ones. So we've got to put them in the right order, essentially. So Tailwind base, our base, Tailwind components, our components, Tailwind utilities, our utilities, in that order, because we want things to cascade, because CSS. That's what I just said. There's also this at layer we can use. So we could say at layer components and just put them in there, and it will put it in the right place for us, which is a lot easier. Then if we have an input file, we can say -- input. This is our input file. I'm using a post CSS file, which is why it's .p CSS, and then outputs this other one. And the last section of this we've seen is plugins. You can write your own plugins, or plugins themselves are also NPM packages. So here's an example of adding another one. So these are all available on the NPM website. This one is called Tailwind CSS List Reset. It's one that I wrote because I used to have a list reset class and removed it before 1.0, and I was using it, so I wanted it back. So I made one, so I can add it, and it goes into that plugin section at the bottom, this bit. So I can just require it, and it will add the things in. This is all it does. It just adds this list reset class back in. Still no padding 0, but it's just that I was using it already. And this is what it does. So we can require in the Tailwind CSS plugin. It gives us an API that we can use and some functions that we can use, like add utilities, and then we can use that to add utilities. So this is a really simple example, but this is the same concept. So you can do it here and release it as an NPM package for everybody to use. You could do it inline and do it in the actual config file yourself if it was just for your project, or you could move it into its own file and call it from your own project as well. Here's a slightly more complicated example. If I want to add child variants, these are probably added to the framework by now, but just an example. You can just use add variant rather than add utility, and you can use add variant and add them in. So if you want some tips, if you want to add this to an existing project, because it is a bit opinionated, and it includes a lot of reset styles out of the box. So it wants to make all your H1s the same size and the font weight and everything, not a thing. So it has that base layer that we talked about, but we can turn it off. So we can say there's a hidden core plugins key that you can use, and say pre-flight, we can set that to false. So don't generate any base reset styles. There's also an option to add a prefix. So if we want, instead of saying flex, we could have it say TW flex or my project flex. Very rarely do I need to use this, but the only thing I can think of is in Drupal 7 when we had a block class for an actual block. That would conflict with the display block class. It's the only one I could think of, really. I haven't had any issues with it in Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 or Drupal 10. We can also make them all important, which is another usual sort of CSS no-no. But for utility classes, if I put a utility class and say font bold, I want it to be font bold. So maybe usually set those to important is fine, I think, in that case. Alternatively, you can set an area on your page and it will make it important inside that area, which is also quite nice. And if you really want it to be, you can also add the exclamation mark to your class name, and that works as well. So definitely make this flex by adding that. So it's a separate class name, which you have to generate, but it does the same thing. So Drupal camp. So I want to talk about CSS, Tailwind CSS and Drupal quickly. There is a starter kit theme. I was making Tailwind-based themes for clients and day jobs and things. So I moved it into its own project as sort of a starter kit, people to look at. It's got its own Tailwind config file. It's got some base templates. It's meant to be, again, an opinionated starter kit for you to either git clone and then use for yourself. But it's a good starter kit, really. It doesn't do an awful lot, but it saves me writing the same files every time. And yeah, we can see this again. So we do have the top file is the dist file. So I do have the compiled CSS in there, so people could use it on Simply Test Me or Tugboat. It does mean I need to go in every so often and recompile it to get the newer version, but I'm a bit behind with that. But it is in there. So in theory, you could just add it to a project and it would just work. You don't need to do the build step for it to work. So the idea is, well, my idea was people would git clone it, put it into their project, rename everything, and it would be their theme now, and they could do what they want with it. It does say there's about 200 sites using it on the project page, so that's fine. Something I've recently found out about, and I was just trying this lunchtime, is that we can use starter kit now in core, and they've actually got a thing for this. So I think, or at least when I was testing it earlier on, that we have to use compose require, first of all, to have it in our project. And then the version of 5 version is the Drupal 10 compatible one. So I can compose require it onto my project. And then I can do this. I can say PHP web core script Drupal, generate theme, give it a theme name, and then tell it which starter kit to use. And I've added a starter kit :true to my info file for the base, for the starter kit theme. It's not a base theme, it's a starter kit theme. Yeah, so that will make a new theme called my theme, and it will show up on the theme page. So both will show up now. It says my theme is based on, this one is Alpha 5 because it's based on Alpha 5 version of Tailwind, and both show up in this. So I'm interested to find out more about how that works, because how do I deal with backwards compatibility if I don't want people to use it for long term? But if people can use it in this way, I would assume that I can now make Alpha 5, 6, 7 beta stable, and they would keep their version also in sync. So something I'm going to look into more. I only found out about it lunchtime. I thought I'll give that another try. And this is what it looks like. Fresh Drupal install, and did that and ran this, set it to be my theme. This is what it looks like. So it's supposed to reset everything and get out of your way, essentially. So finally, I'm just going to show a couple of tweets. This is one from Tailwind CSS account. Do you think Tailwind was a horrible idea when you started using it? A lot of people have this opinion it's backwards from what we used to seeing. And we all have it. There's this thing to begin with. It's aversion to it. And then Paul responded, I saw a talk on Tailwind CSS at a conference, spent 15 minutes afterwards discussing it with the presenter, how it was horrible. We all have this reaction to begin with, including me. And they said, try it for a bit or for a week or something, and then see how you feel. Right? If you don't like it, don't use it again. Go back to doing it the other way if that's what you want. But they did, and then they liked it. And that said, it was me. This was a WordCamp in Bristol quite a few years ago. And yeah, now they like it. But everybody has this reaction, I think. And if you're still on the fence about, if it's the right thing for me or it's not how Tailwind, how CSS is usually taught, I suggest you to give it a try and see if you like it or not. And then if you don't, then don't use it again. But personally, I found the productivity benefits of it. I can move a lot faster doing components with Tailwind because I'm only working in one file. But also, I can go onto another project and use the same classes without having to think, how does this project do CSS, for example? So some links. There's YouTube account for Tailwind CSS. The theme, obviously, is mine. It's not affiliated by Tailwind or Tailwind Labs. Pro Tailwind is something by Simon, who used to work for Tailwind, who used to do Drupal back in the day as well. He's now doing his own course creation and things. And then the Drupal theme is on Drupal.org that you can compose and require and use. My website's at the bottom. I did do a workshop online for Drupal Florida, I think, during the thing that we can't talk about. And yeah, that's recorded. So recently I put a link to that on my email list. So if you want to find out more, I'll either put it on the page, on the DCG page. And yeah, you could watch me talk about Tailwind for 4 hours if this wasn't enough. If this wasn't enough. So cool. So have you got any questions? Any of that? Throw the dice. Yep. Oh, that was pretty good. I've been impressed by everybody's cube throwing ability at the whole conference.
So I generally use Tailwind.
Is it on? I'm not sure. I can't hear.
Can you hear me? Can you?
No.
Hello? Ooh.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I'm using Tailwind for quite some time. Very happy with it. As a backend developer, I'm not that scary into styling things. So I confirm. But like one case I encountered, and I understand all the architecture and why this is like this, but I was wondering if you have any suggestion of what's the best approach to such a situation. So consider a situation when there is a color picker in my UI for users to choose, like for them to choose like this is the category and I want to use this color. So obviously Tailwind needs to see this specific class in order to be generated. So like, okay, I understand I print it with a twig variable and like I need to print it, generate a file, something like, so the best I could think of is like create on the fly a file and just print those classes. So then Tailwind can parse it. So I was thinking if you have any better ideas rather than that.
Okay, let me repeat that. So we've got a color picker in the CMS that people can use to then pick the color, but then Tailwind doesn't know about that color, so then you can't use it. So it doesn't work or doesn't get used or something. Is that?
Yes, because I would have to use that arbitrary value, right? Like to put this is the color, and for Tailwind to include it in the CSS, it has to see it. But I am printing this only in the variable because it comes straight from the database, right?
Yeah. So the problem again, I think, is so if Tailwind doesn't know about it, it's not going to generate it like we saw with the config thing. The complicated part, I think, is if you've got a literal color picker, the colors could be infinite, right? There's going to be so many colors that you could pick from. If you had a set list, then it would be maybe different. I've done something similar. I don't know whether it was the right thing to do, but I have done it before where I've essentially written a drush command that exports, I can't remember exactly what it was now, if I'm honest, but values out of the database and then puts them into a file on disk, and then I have Tailwind scan that file. Because Tailwind doesn't care. It's not going to pass through the file and then go, oh, it's not that. As long as it sees that string somewhere, then it's fine. I mean, the other thing you could do, if you only had 5, is you could just put the strings in a comment in a file somewhere, and that would work as well. There is a safe list or an allow list, or there's some option in the config as well that you could say don't remove these classes if you only had a small number.
You can extend it and put
the complication bit, I think, is
many buttons.
Yeah, because you've got so many options. If they literally give them a whole color picker, that might be tricky. So maybe the other way I'd probably do that, I've had that situation, is to not do the Tailwind thing and just put an inline style for that color and just set that background, that color inline style.
I actually had a similar problem where people could choose a color and it would have to be applied across the page or across many pages. And the color is saved in the database, so it can be retrieved, and it's printed in a Twig template as a CSS variable. So there's a base color for the CSS variable, but if you print it at the beginning of the header of the page, it gets overridden by the version you render from the database in your Twig file. So it doesn't use any special trick like Tailwind or SAS or anything like that. It's quite a basic way to do it, and it works really well.
Yeah,
you can just override a CSS variable.
I'm really interested by it because Tailwind CSS sort of started off. Adam was using less, right, to begin with, and it was sort of inspired by that. And I think then Bootstrap moved to SAS, which made him want to make his own thing, if I'm remembering back to the early streams that he was doing. So yeah, that was quite interesting. But I am really interested in seeing how CSS variables now comes into it. And the new version of Tailwind and Tailwind 4 is configured using CSS variables or custom properties. So --color -red is the thing instead of that config file. So yeah, I mean, Simon's used it in his things as well. I've used it, and now they're becoming more, I think, natively supported in browsers as well. I think that's a really interesting option to start looking at, and I've used that approach to do a whole theming plugin that I can use on a Drupal multi-site and say, use the same theme across both, but make it use site A theme and site B theme, which are essentially the same with different colors.
Are we out of time, or is there? In -2 minutes? Yeah. Well, then we're out of time. So
yeah, chat afterwards or get in touch with any of these things. Theme things, there's obviously the issue queue, but there's also, you can get in touch with me directly as well if you've got questions. So
thank you.
Thank you very much.